Welcome to our 17.1 through 3 review. In this PowerPoint, you'll see kind of a basic outline format, so pay special attention to what you are listening to and what I'm explaining as I go through this simplistic slideshow. So this painting I'm starting with because it demonstrates various components of life in the 18th century Europe. It shows a clear hierarchy between the rich upper class, with like the noblewoman in the foreground and the masses of the working class. The rich woman conducts business transactions with foreign merchants, while the working class engage in various manual activities. The artist was trying to illustrate a thriving economy in one of Europe's major ports in the 18th century. The number of ships and the presence of foreigners is evidence of a lucrative seaborne trade with other nations and cultures. Okay, so let's start with working the land. So the legacy of the open field system, I want to start by explaining what the open field system is. In this system, the fields were open and the land was divided into several strips with no hedges or fences. To prevent soil exhaustion, some of the fields were left fallow, either on a 2 or 3 year rotation, and crops were rotated. We have traditional village rights in that open meadows were used for hay and animal pasture. Poor women would glean grain, and the woodlands were held in common for firewood, berries, and building materials. The social conditions of the this open field system were that the state and the landlords levied heavy taxes and high rents. The peasants were worst off in Eastern Europe, where some had to work many days on the lord's land with no pay, and somewhat better off in Western Europe, where serfs could own land and pass it on to their children. We have these new methods of agriculture where we are starting to eliminate the fallow, meaning alternating grain with nitrogen restoring crops like peas, beans, turnips, potatoes, clovers, and grasses, which in turn meant better feed for animals, more fodder, hay, and root crops for the winter months, larger herds of cattle and sheep, more meat and better diets, more manure for fertilizer, and more grain for bread. So we have this enclosure movement that we read about, and the agricultural innovators like experimental scientists and a few big landowners, they fenced the individual shares of the common pasture land in order to farm more effectively. And this was at the expense of poor peasants who relied on common fields for farming and pasture. So we have a mixture of like old methods and new methods. Poor rural people opposed the enclosure system since their survival was at stake. In some countries, they found allies in the nobility since they were wary of the financial costs of purchasing and enclosing land. However, the new and old systems stood side by side as late as the 19th century in some parts of Western Europe. Excuse me. So continuing with working on the land, the leadership starts with the Dutch initiative. The Dutch were forced to take the lead in draining marshes since the Low Countries were one of the most densely populated regions in Europe and had a growing urban population. In England, we have this agricultural innovation where Dutch experts helped to drain the extensive marshes in rainy England. Jethro Tull was an important English innovator who developed better farming methods through empirical research. By 1870, English farmers were producing 300% more food than they had produced in 1700. And then we have a market-driven estate agriculture where a tiny minority of English and Scottish landowners held most of the land in England, relying on an ever smaller number of landless laborers for their workforce. In no other European country did proletarianization, or the transformation of large numbers of small peasant farmers into landless rural wage earners, go so far. All right, so we have this population explosion, and we have this history of many obstacles to population growth before the 1800s. Prior to 1700, we know the population rebounded from the Black Death by the mid-16th century, and by 1600, the increase in population put a strain on resources. Irregular cyclical patterns were characterized by sudden drops in population due to disease, famine, and war. So we have this demographic crisis that was brought on by a famine, result of a low crop yield and periodic crop failures, epidemic disease like the Black Death, and war. So like the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War, in which more than 2/3 of the inhabitants died in some of the German states. So we have this new pattern of population growth in the 18th century. The European population doubled between 1700 and 1835. Women married younger and bore more children, and there was a general decline in mortality. The bubonic plague is disappearing. The year 1720 to 1722 marked the last outbreak of the plague in Marseille, France. So strict quarantine measures and good luck were factors in its disappearance. We also have improvements in water supply and sewage, public health measures such as swamp drainage to reduce the insect population, and better water supply and sewage systems were implemented to promote general good health. And then we have some safeguarding of the food supply. Excuse me. We have advances in transportation that led to emergency food supplies being brought in to lessen the impact of crop failure and famine. New foods like potatoes were introduced that were more nutritious. War, famine, and disease still existed, but their severity was moderated. So you can see in this chart the growth of population between 1550 and 1850. Here we have, you can compare all the in different countries between a 2-year time span of 1650 and 1850. I'm trying to save time and go fast, so you can pause the graph to really look at it. Okay, so let's talk about the growth of rural industry. So the increase in the number of landless rural workers led to the development of industry in rural areas. So the cottage industry was a stage of industrial development in which rural workers used hand tools in their homes to manufacture goods on a large scale. So we have the putting out system. In the 18th century system of rural industry in which a merchant loaned or put out raw materials to cottage workers who processed them and returned the finished products to the merchant. We are starting to divide production into different stages, as one group of workers would spin the raw wool into thread, another would bleach it, another would dye it, another would weave it into cloth. And this happened as industries grew in scale and complexity. We have advantages to the putting out system, where an abundance of underemployed laborers who were landless, poor peasants were allowed into industries, and these industries developed rapidly. Production was unregulated in the countryside and did not need to meet guild standards. As a result, by 1700, English industry was more rural than urban. So, a lot of different components of the lives of rural textile workers is evolving. Living conditions, first of all, because for most workers, a small one-room cottage with tiny windows, little space, few pieces of furniture, and a large weaver's loom was all they had. In terms of the workers, all members of the family helped in the work. 4 to 5 spinners were needed to keep one weaver steadily employed. In many cases, widows and single women worked in their spare time. Hence the origin of the word spinster. And then with working conditions, we have conflicts between workers and employers, desperate conditions for female workers, low wages, desperate poverty. We have a lack of merchant control over cottage workers, leading to new police powers to punish theft, drunkenness and mortality, laziness, or even holding on to small amounts of yarn or cloth. So in this map, you can see the industries that are growing and where throughout Europe they were growing. Okay, so the growth of rural industry continues. We have the Industrious Revolution. And the Industrious Revolution is the shift that occurred as families in northwestern Europe focused on earning wages instead of producing goods for household consumption. This reduced their economic self-sufficiency but increased their ability to produce consumer goods. So this reduced leisure time, faster pace of work, and the direction of the labor of women and children away from the production of goods for household consumption and toward wage work outside the home. The role of women and girls is changing as women are earning lower wages but played a proportionally greater role in household decision making and made enough surplus income to be able to purchase goods, spurring the rapid growth of the textile industries. So this is the foundation for the Industrial Revolution. These new patterns of labor set the stage for the Industrial Revolution. They created households in which all members worked for wages rather than a united family business. Today, the world's experiencing a second industrial revolution characterized by stagnant wages and increased demand for consumer goods. All right, and I think that concludes, yes it does, it concludes the video for today. So go ahead and submit any questions you have in the Google form on Google Classroom.